Hi, everybody. It's so great to be with all of you today, and so excited to be here to present our very first FAN webinar in sponsorship with John Burton Advocates for Youth. Today, we will be presenting the webinar advocating for effective implementation of, or advocating for and implementing effective tuition waivers. And we have with us our colleagues from Texas. As hopefully you know, this is the first in a series of webinars that we are presenting, co-hosted by Fostering Academic Achievement Nationwide, or FAN, and John Burton Advocates for Youth, or JBAY, as you might hear us refer to it. You can find the other two webinars on your screen. We hope that you look forward to registering and joining us for those in the following months. And for today, we look forward to having you hear from our wonderful colleagues from Texas. We also just want to say very quickly that in addition to this webinar, we have a publication that has been released this week. Some of you may have already found that on the JBAY website. It is also available today on the Fostering Academic Achievement Nationwide website. And I will be sure that we have all of the links available to you at the end of our webinar. So definitely make sure that you stay tuned for that. And again, we just really want to say thank you so much for all of you for joining us. This webinar and the document, this webinar series, I should say, and the documents that will come of it are part of a very generous grant brought to you by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Stewart Foundation, and the Walter S. Johnson Foundation. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our wonderful hosts today, our wonderful presenters. So first up, we have Dr. Toni Watt. Toni Watt is a professor and chair of sociology at Texas State University. Dr. Watt received her PhD in sociology with an emphasis on demography and with an emphasis in demography from the University of Texas at Austin. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in research methodology, drugs and society, and mental health. Her research is both academic and applied and focuses on improving outcomes for children and youth who have experienced trauma and/or the foster care system. Next, we have Dr. Christine Norton. Dr. Norton received her PhD in social work from Loyola University in Chicago. She has a Master's of Arts in Social Service Administration from the University of Chicago and a Master's of Science in Experimental Education from Minnesota State University. Dr. Norton is a research scientist with the Outdoor Behavioral Healthcare Center, and she helped launch the Foster Care Alumni Creating Educational Success Program, or FACES, at Texas State. She is the Foster Care Liaison Officer to the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and is the past president of the Education Reach for Texans Board of Directors. Dr. Norton is active in study abroad and is also a Fulbright Scholar teaching adventure therapy in the Department of Civic Education and Leadership at National Taiwan Normal University. And finally, we have Dr. Sheila Bustillos. Dr. Bustillos is a strategy development principal for the Children's Advocacy Center of Texas. She works with a team of researchers motivated to end child sexual abuse in Texas. She is also a co-founder and board member for the Education Reach for Texans, a 501c3 championing post-secondary education success for students with experience in foster care. Her research focuses on child sexual abuse prevention, students with experience in foster care and higher education, and the intersections of diversity, equity, and inclusion with child sexual abuse. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to our colleagues.
Okay, I think I'm up first. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. As you heard, I'm Toni Watt, and I'm going to kick off our presentation today. Maddie, thank you for doing the slides. I think we need to go maybe to the next one right after this one. Yeah, just to show a little bit more about the people involved in the project. And I want to thank you, Maddie, and thank Debbie for orchestrating this entire project and for your wisdom and guidance and support at every step along the way for Christine, Sheila, and I as we worked on this. So we really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone. It's amazing. I can't believe how many people are on the webinars. So it's fantastic to see such a big group and to get an opportunity to come here and talk to you today about this topic and to share information and ideas. So I do appreciate that you're all here. So Maddie, if you can go on to the next slide, what I'm going to do to get us started is just give a little bit of background on what information is publicly available about tuition and fee waivers for students who've experienced foster care. And some of this information is available on nonprofit websites, some is in the published academic literature, but it's really not consolidated anywhere. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what we know from those sources. As many of you know, there is a movement for states to develop tuition fee waivers for youth who've been in care. At this point, we are up to about 37 states that have this type of program. But one of the things that we've learned is that these states vary dramatically in terms of how they've designed and implement these waiver programs. So, for example, they differ even from what they're called. So in 1993, Texas was one of the first states to legislate a tuition and fee waiver program for youth who'd been in foster care, because it's so old and because it was specifically designed in that way, very narrowly just for youth who'd been in care. Many people know about the Texas program, but many of us, other people, myself included, for quite a while thought that California didn't have a tuition fee waiver program, for example, when in fact they do. It's just called the Cal Grant. So it's a grant program that covers a number of different populations, but it does include youth who've been in foster care and makes special provisions for those youth. So it might not be called a tuition and fee waiver program just for that group, but it essentially operates in the same way and has that same kind of coverage. So the states differ considerably in terms of what those programs are called and how they're designed in terms of who's eligible, how do you apply, how do you access those particular funds and things of that sort. So for that reason, we wanted to be able to help people understand what are, if not best practices, at least promising practices or lessons learned from the states that have adopted these waivers about how to design them and the potential impact. So Maddie, we can go on to the next slide. Just to give you a little bit of a visual display so you can see which states have waiver programs. The orange states do and the gray states don't. But as I mentioned, they vary quite a bit. And a great resource for beginning to understand how these programs are written and how different they are from state to state. You can go to the next slide, Maddie, which is some of the literature. And this is a little bit of a dense slide, but we can sort of go through some of these studies and what they tell us. I'll try to do that quickly. But Hernandez, Day, and Henson had a fantastic study in 2017 where they did a descriptive analysis of the states that had these waiver programs. At that time, there were only 22 states that did. But one of the most striking findings from that study, and I refer to this study all the time because it was really so detailed and useful, was that of the states with the programs, half of those states distributed less than 50 waivers per year, which is such a small number that it's reasonable to think, well, those waiver programs aren't going to have any kind of significant impact, or certainly probably can't move the needle in terms of changing post-secondary outcomes for youth who've been in care in that whole state. So that was really eye-opening for me. And some of those states aren't just distributing around 50, they're distributing 10 or 12 or even just 15 waivers, whereas other states are distributing thousands of waivers per year. So what I was interested in is trying to understand, as we've had this sort of national movement, has this really changed outcomes across the country? Has it had an impact as all of these states have started to adopt these programs? So I work with some colleagues at Texas State to analyze the National Youth and Transition Database to see if states with waiver programs had higher rates of post-secondary enrollment compared to states without those programs. And what we found is that they did, but the increase in post-secondary enrollment that we saw in that state, those states were only just a little bit higher. It was a really small difference. And the states varied so much that really our conclusions were that this movement across the country has not really affected post-secondary enrollment rates in any substantive way. So what we really wanted to then do is go on a state-by-state basis and try to figure out, well, what happens in each individual state, and is the way that that state waiver program designed having an impact? So of course, we wanted to start with Texas, and we're lucky enough to be able to do that because of a development in our state legislature. The legislature mandated in 2015 that the Department of Family and Protective Services coordinate with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to do a data exchange and start tracking post-secondary outcomes for youth who'd been in care. And this was really a fantastic development. We were all excited about it from our research team. It took a couple years to try to get that off the ground. But our team worked with both of those agencies to try to gain access to the data. We negotiated, we pleaded, we cajoled, we did everything we could, and eventually I think we wore them down. So they let us have access to the data that has been coming from that data exchange on an annual basis. And we've done a couple of analyses, but the most recent one is the one that's listed here, where we were able to have access to the individual level data and follow youth who'd been in foster care in a particular cohort from age 18 to 24, see if they enrolled in higher education, see if they used the waiver, and see if use of the waiver affected outcomes. And what we found was that the youth who enrolled in higher education and used the waiver were 3.5 times more likely to receive a bachelor's degree than the youth who enrolled in higher education, were qualified and eligible for the waiver, but didn't use it. So that was really the first piece of evidence that we had ever been able to find to say that waiver programs not only could have an impact, but that that impact could be large. When you do evaluation, I think a lot of times people just want to know, does a program or policy work, or does it improve outcomes? But really, you have to ask that question and then the follow-up question, which is, if it does improve outcomes, by how much? Is it substantive? Is it meaningful? And I don't know if I have any stat geeks in the audience, but this 3.5 number is what's called an odds ratio. And odds ratios can be evaluated in an absolute sense. We have thresholds for which we can know if the odds ratio is small, medium, or large. And I can tell you that this is very large. So we were enthusiastic about this finding. It's just one study. It's just Texas. Like all studies, it has its own methodological limitations. But we felt it was a piece of evidence that made us enthusiastic about the potential of tuition waivers to actually have a meaningful impact. So we wanted to continue to talk to people about the importance of the waivers and perhaps try to understand how to do them as best as they can possibly be constructed. Because another piece of information from this study was that we aren't necessarily doing everything right in Texas. Of the youth who qualified for the waiver and enrolled in higher education, we found that 40% of them did not use it. And we're still trying to figure out what's causing that. We think it might be because it's a little cumbersome to access, but we're still working on that. So again, our ultimate conclusion was the waivers have the potential for a substantive impact, but you've got to figure out how to design them in a way that they're going to get used and be able to realize their full potential. And that's really what we wanted to talk about today. So Maddie, if you can go on to the last slide that I'll be covering, just to talk about sort of the basis for our recommendations today. We wanted to have this literature, which is a little bit of a foundation in terms of what has been done and what we could do. We conducted interviews with people from other states that had waiver programs to try to learn from their experiences. And then in Texas, as I mentioned, we've had this program for decades, and we've had Education Reach in Texas, which is a statewide collaborative, working for 10 years now with a lot of key stakeholders, working in academia, working in child protective services, working in nonprofit, and with programming and policy to try to understand how these waiver programs can be best designed and implemented. And so we tried to pull all this information for you to create a set of recommendations for designing, implementing, and evaluating waiver programs. So that's my spiel. That's a little bit of the background. And then now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Christine Norton. And Maddie, you can move on. We're going to offer some recommendations here, and Christine will get us started. And we can take questions as we go or at the end about anything that we cover. So thanks for your time.
Wonderful. Thanks for that background, Tony. I really appreciate all of the research that you have been leading in our state, and we're certainly hoping to see some replication on the national level of some of the tuition and fee waiver research as well. Our first recommendation will not surprise you at all, right? Which is we need to expand the availability of these tuition and fee waiver initiatives and programs. We have some data-driven rationale for doing this, which is that youth in the state of Texas who do use the tuition and fee waiver, as Dr. Watt said, are 3.5 times more likely to graduate from college. So we know that we have 37 states in the United States that are implementing some form of tuition and fee waiver or scholarship program for foster youth. Still, however, a lot of those programs are only distributing, 50% of those programs only distributing fewer than 50 waivers a year. So we need to see increased numbers. A lot of that is because in the states that do offer programs, there are some limitations to those waivers being used at certain institutions. And then there are also caps and limits on the number of students who can use the waivers. So by expanding availability, we would certainly love to see that be expanded to the 13 states that are currently not implementing any kind of tuition and fee waiver. But we're also targeting and looking at the states that do offer the waiver, and even within those states, expanding the eligibility of this pretty spectacular program that has the ability to be an incredible protective factor for our students with lived experience in foster care. Our second recommendation, Maddie, thank you, is for financial aid professionals. This is really, those of you that work in higher education realize that the financial aid piece of higher ed is a complex beast. And we are really working closely with financial aid professionals to shift financial aid policy, both at the state level, but also at the national level. So currently, what we would like to advocate for is that colleges and universities apply the waiver first towards tuition before using other types of aid, such as Pell Grants or the Chafee Educational and Training Voucher or other scholarships. Because remember, the tuition and fee waiver can only be used for currently tuition and fees. So if that other aid gets applied to tuition and fees, it reduces the amount of money left over to pay for living expenses. Whereas if the tuition and fee waiver was applied first, then the Pell Grant, the ETV money could be used towards those non-tuition costs. And we know, those of us that work with foster care students with lived experience in foster care in higher ed, we know that those non-tuition related costs can cause huge barriers in their achieving educational success. Things like housing instability, food insecurity, issues with transportation, the money that it costs to pay for textbooks. We would really like to see the financial aid be used for some of those costs and have the have the tuition and fee waiver applied first. So that is, again, something we're working on here in the state of Texas, but also making a national recommendation for. And you'll see that in a lot of these recommendations, they're coming out of the literature and the research. They're coming out of a lot of our experiences here in Texas, but we're also offering them to you to advocate for at your state level as well as federally. So Maddie, you can advance to our third recommendation, and that is we're really wanting policymakers to define eligibility broadly. Right now, there are so many loopholes and limitations, and quite frankly, it makes it very confusing for young people. But we also want to make sure that our policy recommendations around this tuition and fee waiver are research-based and trauma-informed. So we really believe that there should be no minimum requirements for how long a student was in foster care. The length of time doesn't matter. We know that any amount of time in the foster care system means that that young person has experienced challenges and potential trauma. We also know that when you begin putting restrictions on waiver usage around age or around the type of degree or the length of time that the usage or that the waiver can be utilized, you begin creating barriers for students to achieve educational success. One of the greatest things that I get excited about in Texas, partially because I am a social work professor, I'm also the foster care liaison on my campus, is that our students can come back, they can achieve a bachelor's degree, and then they can continue to use that waiver to pursue an advanced degree. So I've had our foster care students come back and pursue their master's degree, their doctoral degrees, and then really contribute back to the body of knowledge around best practices in so many disciplines. And it's just been very exciting. I also believe that it's really important, based on research, again, that shows that students with lived experience in foster care are more likely to begin their higher education journey at a later age, to not have limits on when the tuition fee waiver can be utilized or when it has to be locked in. Really broadly defining this is going to remove barriers, and that's really what we're talking about in our recommendations. Our fourth recommendation is to streamline the application and verification requirements. So those of you, again, that work in higher education or might have teenagers in your home who are applying to college know that the application process in general for all students can be very complicated. And certainly for our students who are coming out of the foster care system, sometimes they don't even know how to access benefits like the tuition and fee waiver. They may not have heard about it. They may not know what it takes to apply for it, what it takes to verify their eligibility. So again, we are really wanting to remove these barriers. One of the things that has been a very successful policy is to mandate FAFSA completion. That's part of it. But then the second part of mandating FAFSA completion is also to have systemic accountability for what adult in what system is responsible for helping that youth complete the FAFSA. So is it going to be a guidance counselor? Is it going to be a child welfare caseworker? That part also needs to be accountable so that the burden is not just on the young person. We would also recommend greater collaboration between the child welfare system and higher education so that there can be an automatic verification process through a data match. We recognize all of the confidentiality issues related to this data sharing, but we believe that it's possible to remove those barriers for young people. To put the burden on the student to have to verify their eligibility requires multiple steps, and tracking that information down in ways that sometimes very cumbersome. So through this data sharing and matching, we believe we could help remove that verification barrier. And then the final recommendation that I will speak to before turning it over to Dr. Bustillos is to avoid academic or service requirements for eligibility. So in some states, there are requirements for students to utilize the tuition and fee waiver related either to their GPA or to SAP, which is satisfactory academic progress, which is both related to GPA, but also to course completion rates. Again, looking at the data, looking at the research, this is a big ask for all students. Only 1 in 4 students, or excuse me, 1 in 4 students currently of all college students do not meet satisfactory academic progress. And for students with lived experience in foster care, it's only about 1/3 of students. And we know also, based on research, that using satisfactory academic progress as a punitive measure has disproportionate consequences on youth of color as well as students with lived experience in foster care. I just want to share with you anecdotally, because we know that when students fall below satisfactory academic progress, they also lose their federal financial aid benefits. So any Pell Grant money or education and training voucher funds, those also are penalized. And so one of the things that we've seen in Texas that has been amazing is that even when students fall below satisfactory academic progress and they lose their federal financial aid, our tuition and fee waiver is not tied currently to satisfactory academic progress. So that allows these incredibly resilient and educationally persistent and motivated students to go at it even class by class while they work part-time, trying to raise their GPA back up to satisfactory academic progress and then appeal the federal financial aid. So having that tuition fee waiver not be aligned with that allows them to continue in their education. And we've seen that firsthand here in Texas. Also, we know most of our students are working anyway, but to put the added burden on them to be working or doing community service can really be a big ask given some of the educational deficits they may be coming into higher education with. Likewise, to have full-time enrollment status as an eligibility requirement feels cumbersome because we know some of our students need to go part-time so that they can work or take care of their children. Or even be taking care of their mental health needs. So we really believe that these waiver programs should avoid these types of academic and service requirements and certainly avoid any kind of competitive criteria in order to be the most inclusive they can be. So we have 5 more recommendations. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Bustillos to go over those with you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Norton. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to send, hopefully everybody's getting this in the chat. This is a report that came out in 2021. It's called The Overlooked Obstacle, How Satisfactory Academic Progress Policies Impede Student Success and Equity. And so this was put out by the John Burton Foundation, the advocacy, the JBay. And I just want to thank Debbie for their work on this project because it was a very well done report and there's lots of information in there that I think, we can't go into in this presentation because of time, but really like the outlines, the recommendations and policies that they've outlined in that report really fit well with supporting students with experience in foster care as far as satisfactory academic progress goes. So I encourage you all to read that report and consider their policy and recommendations from that report also when you're thinking about creating a waiver or improving your waiver at your state. I do want to take just a second to embarrass Maddie and Debbie and just kind of thank them for all of their work and their leadership and advocacy for decades. I recognize so many people in the participant list and just want to thank you all for being here, but like, so the colleagues, our colleagues from Georgia, Lori, who's on the call, have really been instrumental in supporting students with experience in foster care across the nation. A lot of the reason why we're here today is because of their leadership and advocacy. I feel like we could have written this report just giving examples from California and Michigan from Maddie and Debbie. And so I really just want to thank them for their leadership and for bringing us to the table to have this conversation today. And just to thank you all on the call for your leadership and advocacy. I see our colleagues from Nevada are on the call, and they're some of our newest tuition waivers. So we'll talk about some of the great things that they're doing as well. So just thank you all for being here. Okay, so we are going to talk next about increased cost of attendance. So Christine sort of talked about how we can help students with experience in foster care maintain their financial aid across years. And this recommendation is really to increase to help maximize the amount of aid that they can get on a yearly basis. So those of you who are here, many of you are higher education experts, so this might be a little bit of patronizing, but cost of attendance really is a consideration, and the expected family contribution. These are calculations that the FAFSA uses to kind of calculate student strength. So when we think about cost of attendance, yes, it includes tuition and fees, but it also includes all those other non-tuition costs like room and board, books and supplies, transportation, that sort of thing. So cost of attendance is really what's expected, what a student is expected in any given year for the cost of attendance for that year. So our recommendation here is to actually go to financial aid and advocate for increasing that cost of attendance. It's depending on the institution, it can be a pretty easy process to just go in and have a conversation with them about, especially those who are parenting or pregnant, and expanding cost of attendance for childcare, or expanding cost of attendance for what has been referred to, what John C. has referred to of family privilege. So, our students with experience in foster care really don't, most of the time, have that familial support where they can go and get tires for their car, or, the extra cost that might come with taxes from a job, or with, just little things that might come up, things that they need for class that might not be included in a financial aid package. Small things that come up often, even when it might come with health costs, or students with different abilities might have extra needs as well. And so this sort of increasing this cost of attendance allows at least to somewhat try to address those hidden or emergency costs that students experience with experience in foster care might see in higher education. So again, it's really just like going to a financial aid office, having a conversation with them about increasing their cost of attendance. And usually marginalized students, they find themselves like, this is a common thing that financial aid offices see. So it won't be something they'll be hearing for the first time. So this is a recommendation from us. And you can go ahead and go on to the next one. So this is a huge one for states like Texas. So we recommend that the institutional cost be adequately covered. And we recommend that it actually come from state or federal funds. In Texas, we put the cost on our institutions to pay for higher education. So it is an actual waiver that an institution waives the cost for that student to attend, and the fees for that student to attend, those fees. So with the tuition and fee waiver, a traditional one like that's done in Texas, where an institution might pay for the total cost, it's challenging on our end, because we're the advocates trying to increase higher education access and persistence in graduation for students with experience in foster care. However, let's say you have an institution and they have a very robust support network. Well, they're going to be recruiting students, and students are actually like places like Texas State University, for example. Students, I would hear across the board saying, I want to go to Texas State because they have a support network. Well, then, it puts a lot on the institution then to have lots of students coming to your campus who are then going to have their tuition waived. So then the university is going to have to pay for those costs. So if it comes from a state or federal funds, we can build that campus support network without putting all of the burden on the institution, which the institution really already is going to be held accountable for creating those support networks that we'll talk about in a little bit for students with experience in foster care. So that's our recommendation there, is that those waivers be built with state, federal funds, and then in some cases, some states with private funds. And you can go on to the next one. Awesome. So including students with experience in foster care, including their voice in the process, I have to give you a really cool example of this. So recently, when Vermont implemented a statewide tuition waiver, they included student voice leadership throughout the implementation process. So they conducted a system-wide needs survey, they facilitating foster youth roundtable discussions, and then establishing a system-level peer and community educator role. So this is in particular, and colleagues from Nevada as well have been creating tuition waivers from the beginning with students with experience in foster care with their voice at the center of the table, embedded in the process from start to finish. Checking in with students with experience in care and asking about how their experience are going. how using the waiver is working out for them, how would they like to see things improved or changed or recommended. Student voice has to be sort of embedded through campus support programs and networks, and that is actually the next one. So you can go ahead and go to the next recommendation, Maddie. So all the things that you see on the screen should also have voice from students with experience in foster care, especially when it comes to building campus support programs. And that also might include creating actual student organizations on campus. So I'll talk some about that. So when we're considering liaisons, we call them statewide liaisons in Texas. It's confusing for some states who use the campus coaching language. It's the same, similar things. So liaisons, coaches, we have examples from Michigan and Florida and California who've institutionalized coaches and liaisons or mandated them at the state level. Texas has as well. The problem with ours and the actual benefit, I think, or the way in which Michigan and Florida have imagined their programs is they imagine them with that support, financial support backing this mandate. So for us in Texas, we have statewide liaisons. It is a statewide mandate. It's unfunded. So there's no financial support. There's also a lack in direction for what liaisons should be responsible for. So liaisons sort of like they are supposed to put their name on a website. It's just basic, asked from these liaisons. So they're supposed to build a website with their contact information on it, and they're mandated to find a list of the students on their campus and tell them about their benefits. So often what we find is that there's like a disconnect between universities understanding this mandate, and usually they will sort of just assign someone as another duty as assigned, or they'll just assign somebody with a big title, but that person's really not there doing the day-to-day work with the young students at their school. And so, so what we recommend is that there actually these additional supports be funded supports. So liaisons really need those funds, full-time employees, or, at the most, the graduate student or part-time employees who might be able to help at the institution connect those students to their benefits and resources. But we do recommend full-time employees at every 2-year, 4-year, well, in Texas, every 2-year, 4-year public institution who does support the waiver. So when we're talking about campus support programs, there is a lot of support right now, literature that shows that campus support programs are effective. And so we're seeing that, even though there's no national model for what we're talking about today, right? There's no national model for the tuition waiver, which is where these recommendations are coming from, but there isn't a model for campus support programs either. We do have an idea of what's working and what's not working. And much of that you can see in the report, not detailed in the report, but links to reports that go in depth. Texas right now, we're actually evaluating our campus support programs across the state, and we're learning a lot from that. But we really recommend that states invest in these programs. So again, we'll go back to California. They use state funds to build a comprehensive service program, and it's known as Next Up. And it's at 46 of the state's community colleges. And it provides a lot of these necessary services that campus support provides: case management, financial support, academic and personal counseling, life skills training, career counseling. So a lot of these campus support programs provide some of these things. In addition, some campus support programs provide housing, health and wellness activities, cultural identity workshops. So many of you might be familiar with the Casey sort of like 7 life supports. I should have written that down because that's not what it's called. But I can provide a link to it after this presentation. It's a really important framework for campus support programs. And we have a link to it in our report, but the visual is nice, right? So when we're thinking about campus supports, we really have to think about the holistic student and what they need on a level, considering that that person might not have familial support to help them through these sort of like important life stages that they go through while they're in higher education. So that's campus support. The next thing is extended foster care. Many of you on this call might be familiar with the Midwest study. The Midwest study looked at 700 youth with experience in foster care. And the researchers found that by age 23 or 24, that 29% of their participants had been homeless. So extended foster care, the real benefit here is that we know that homelessness continues to be one of like the top 3, top 5 issues that our students with experiencing care face. That might be temporarily homelessness, it might be chronic homelessness. Regardless, extended foster care and sort of like help these students, provide them supports for homelessness is not an issue for them. Many states provide financial support for living arrangements, or provide living arrangements where there's no, where they don't ask for rent monthly. 26 states have extended foster care at that age, that range from age 18 to 21. And most extended foster care programs offer supervised independent living. So for an example, in Texas, we've actually advocated at a state level and had some real champions in Texas bring this home for us. That we have 15 plus campuses right now across the state that have implemented supervised independent living programs on university campuses. So now students can actually choose a university as a supervised independent site, and then they get that case management and support, as well as support from a campus liaison or a coach. So that just really enhances their likelihood of being successful in higher ed. So the last thing about extended care, and this is what I really think brings this home, is that the Midwest study showed us that students with experience in foster care who participate in extended foster care are twice as likely to attend college and twice as likely to have at least 1 year of college completed by their 21st birthday than their foster care peers without extended care. So that's another additional support that, that we recommend suggesting to the young adults that we serve. And lastly, like some of the shout outs I gave before, we have statewide backbone organizations that are very important to the national movement to support students with experience in foster care. So I could go on all day about this, but I'll just briefly say that our national organization, it's a coalition that around 2016, leadership from Fostering Success Michigan and Casey Family Programs got together leaders across the nation that were supporting students with experience in foster care and formed a coalition called Fostering Academic Achievement Nationally, FAN. So we can either put the link to FAN's website in the chat. It's also in the report as well. But you know, FAN, they act as a knowledge sharing coalition to advance systems, improve policy, conduct original research, and educate the public about the challenges that students with experience in care face. So, you know, many of these organizations are privately funded or state funded by the legislature, and some, like the ones in Texas. So we've been going like 13 years strong with Education Reach for Texans, and no one's ever been paid to do this work. It's all on a volunteer basis in Texas. So that's not ideal. we would encourage everyone on the call, if you don't have a backbone organization at your state, to, you know, think about creating one. And then if you do have one, to get involved with that organization because they do some amazing work. And then there's also movements at the national level to support students with experience in foster care. Many of you know the Fostering Post-Secondary Success for Foster and Homeless Youth Act of 2021. It's known as the Kildee Bill. Is looking at providing a recognition program to identify and highlight colleges doing this work, and then also to create a national center for supporting students with experience in foster care across the country. So this has been huge. You can go on to the next slide. So the last recommendation that we have is to evaluate and monitor impact and equity. So really this is pretty simple. The diversity, equity, and inclusion aspect of this, not so simple, so I'll get to that. So when we think about statewide data sharing and yearly monitoring, it's really important. So we've got Tony at a national level, you know, working hard to create those, to keep those relationships strong, to get that yearly data so we can have that data sharing, but then also monitor what's happening at our state. Many other states have data sharing agreements as well, and you can see the value of your impact, and also, like Tony shared, you can also see how great that impact is. So we don't want to only know if what we're doing is significant. We want to know like how and in which way the work that we're doing is significant to having that ultimate goal, which is graduating students with experience in care. And then our recommendations is actually would love for states to be able to have waiver programs where we construct them more similarly to have better comparisons, because some of the reports, we've linked to some reports in our report that you can read, and many of them state that it's hard to create like this cross comparison because the waivers are constructed so differently, right? So it's like apples to oranges comparisons all over the place. So we really don't have waivers that are structured so similarly where it's easy to compare. So that's that recommendation as well. And then when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, findings, they're very slim, and the studies we do have are kind of contradictory to studies you will see about race and ethnicity on a national level. So I'll say, like, lots of research has showed that there are inequities between marginalized populations, students of color, and their white peers, that, across the board, with access, persistence, and graduation. However, when we examined it, in Texas examined it, we actually, our waiver use by gender and race and ethnicity, we didn't find any significant differences by subgroup. And we're continuing to monitor that, right, yearly. But there are differences in higher education outcomes that we did find by race and ethnicity, with Hispanic students with experience in foster care having lower graduation rates than white students with experience in foster care. So like I talked about, like this diversity, equity, and inclusion findings should be taken with a lot of caution when we're sharing this information, because even as we have limited information on our end about race and ethnicity and what that looks like with students in experience in care, we just need more research in that area. We need more monitoring of waivers to understand actually to have a deeper understanding about already marginalized populations, right? So the intersections of multiple marginalized students and how that looks when it's particularly focused on tuition waiver and tuition waiver usage, access into higher education and graduation rates. So again, even though our findings are sort of contradictory to what's on a national level, we didn't find any significant differences. It doesn't mean that they're not there, or we just need to monitor that moving forward and have other states doing the same. So we do not only recommend that we evaluate and monitor, but that we look at that impact that equity has on those findings as well. And then I believe the last slide is really just wrapping everything up. So, so from the report, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, we suggest that you do. We do have 10 recommendations in the report that are outlined similarly to how we outline them today. And then we do want to just emphasize that research shows increased graduation rates with the waiver usage. So tuition waivers, we're seeing some promising data, and they're worth investing in at your state level, and they're worth advocating for, improvements based on these recommendations to already existing waiver programs. Waiver programs vary in implementation and structure, as you can see from the report, and also some from examples today. They look very, some call it waivers, some call it scholarships, some call it grants. But the whole point is to support students with experience in foster care where financial barriers do not become an issue for why they don't enter higher education. There are already so many other barriers that they face and are overcoming, but waiver and like finding tuition dollars should not be one of those. Providing additional help. Waivers are only one type of support. So just instilling a waiver and then just like letting students kind of go on their own and take care of themselves is not what we recommend. We recommend a full systematic support system for these young adults. So campus support programs, extended foster care, liaisons and coaches, and that's in addition to the tuition waiver. So really building these support systems and being thoughtful from the beginning on how that's going to look and how that's going to roll out. Students with experience in foster care voice is critical. We talked about that. It's always critical throughout this. And I'm also seeing that we have students with experience in foster care here on the call. So We appreciate you being here. It is amazing that you are here. I saw one of them maybe getting a PhD. Congratulations to you. That's amazing. Your voice is super critical in this effort. Statewide and backbone organizations do bolster support. Their whole purpose is to provide really this macro look at your state and how your state is supporting students with experience in foster care. So their expertise is valuable, but also the work that they're doing is to support institutions. So whether you're an institution or you're at the legislative level or you're at the funding level, really supporting these backbone organizations will help support students with experience in foster care and it'll trickle down to them. And then evaluate and monitor those programs. And we're happy to be a network of support to help you through that process and help you think through what that evaluation and monitoring process should look like. So again, thank y'all so much for being here today. And I think we're gonna open it for questions.
Thanks, Sheila.
Hi, everybody. That was so great. Thank you all so much. Just even though, you know, I've read the report several times, it just is so great to hear all the information coming directly from you. And we do have some questions. I will say we have about 8 minutes for questions, so feel free to drop those in the Q&A if you have not already. There were a couple questions that came up specifically about the limitations or maybe disincentives about having tuition waivers, things that might limit college access or just the opportunities for college going. And so I wondered if you all wanted just to respond to that.
Sorry, Maddie, can you just clarify the specifics of the question that you want us to answer?
Yeah, so one of the specific questions read, are there any impacts of a tuition waiver that might limit college access for students and any potential downfalls or risks of tuition waiver legislation?
Well, I will say one risk is that it could get cut. Usually, sometimes if you have, we've fought this for years. If you have legislative support, it's fantastic. But then, you know, like showing them if it's working or not is sometimes difficult, right? And, you know, we just got to the point, I think the last 3 or 4 years where we had this wonderful data sharing. But before that, it was really kind of on the chopping block every other year. It's like, do we keep the waiver? Do we get rid of the waiver? Is it working? And so that's what's so important about having that evaluation and monitoring, because I think when you have both of those plans together, then it's easier to come back and say, hey, you know, here, even when we come back to the legislature and say, hey, you know, our students have less than a 2% graduation rate for 2-year and 4-year institutions, but you know, we can look at the data in different ways and say, yes, but the ones that are using the waiver are 3.5 times more likely to graduate. So when you monitor that, you can kind of come back and say that. So like, it's a contentious, it can be a contentious relationship, but I think that legislation is, of course, institutionalizing that waiver is important. Tony, you want to?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and we don't talk about those risks very often at all. And so I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head. But one thing that strikes me as a risk is if you create a program that encourages students to enroll in college, but you don't support them once they're there and they don't succeed, then you've created another really disruptive, emotionally stressful experience for those students who may be taking out debt, who then enroll in college and then don't finish. And even in higher ed, I mean, higher ed's graduation rates are abysmal for the general population still. They're only, you know, a little over 50%. So we have to think, what if these youth enroll, drop out, and then they have debt and no credentials? So that's the reason that Sheila's discussion of these additional supports, if you're going to have a waiver, have additional supports on campus to help those students progress through their programs too.
Mm-hmm.
I also know, just one final thing, I know we spoke to some of the limitations in our state with the tuition and fee waiver being an unfunded mandate, and sometimes the resentment or lack of support that might create on a college campus. So when we were tracking our outcomes at my particular university, we were not only looking at freshman retention and graduation rates, but also enrollment, because we wanted to make sure that we were still admitting and enrolling students with lived experience in foster care, and not somehow discriminating against them because they have this unfunded tuition and fee waiver. And in fact, we have seen our enrollment and admission rates increasing over the years, as well as our retention and graduation rates. So that's been a good thing, but definitely something to monitor in case there was ever that bias within your institution.
Mhm. So there was another question that goes along with this. It talks about if states should pay for the tuition waiver. And I'm curious, you all I obviously have a perspective for sure, but I'm curious kind of what the benefits and the negatives are maybe of how tuition waivers are or are not funded.
Christine, you want to go first?
I think I spoke to that just briefly,
Yeah.
that when it is an unfunded mandate, it puts the pressure on the university. And there are then sometimes covert or hidden implicit biases that can emerge towards the students themselves. Are they deserving? Are they undeserving? And so these are very subtle issues, but I think ultimately that there could and should be some federal funding, maybe even in the form of block grants that states can apply for, not only to fund these tuition and fee waivers, but also to fund even some staff positions or some efforts for the campus support programs and foster care liaison positions. Because again, it's about the long-term investment and yield return on investment. And so if you are going to provide money towards the waiver, then also, like Dr. Watt was saying, providing money towards the supports so that the waiver actually works and we're setting students up for success and getting that return on our investment.
Yeah, that's great. So one of our attendees noted that you all use the term students with experience in foster care and asked if that should be used rather than former foster youth. And so would love to hear your thoughts on the use of person first language.
So Tony and I worked really closely with Angela Hoffman Cooper. Some of y'all might know her. She is a foster scholar. And if you don't know who foster scholars are, especially the young person who's on the call getting a PhD, foster scholars are people with experience in foster care who are actually can be hired as research consultants specifically on, well, we're doing lots of research, right? Many of them have their own research interests, but we have contracted with foster scholars on other projects. Thank you, Christine. On other projects to actually from start to finish do the research with our research team. Students with experience in foster care actually came from that group. They were foster care alumni. I can't find a young adult who that title was working for. So I think that they started using that term, and we just picked it up based on just their personal experience, but then they're also their expertise in the field, and that's the term they were using, and that's the term that we picked up. Tony, did you want to add any more to that?
No, just that it's been fantastic to work with scholars like Angela Hoffman and Cooper and some others as well, because they've taught us so much and been willing to share those ideas and explanations for why they prefer the terms. They're really great discussions we've had about that.
So we have some really great questions. We're going to have to answer some of them offline, but I promise that I will be sure to get back with those of you that we didn't get to. One last question. This is kind of a big one. Do we know why there are only 37 states that offer the waiver? As the researcher, Tony, I'm like, have you looked into that?
No, I have not, but I sure do hope that it's just an issue of education and information, that this is part of what this effort is all about, right? To share the idea that others are doing this, it can be done, it's feasible, and it can have a powerful impact if you share information and ideas about how to construct it effectively. So hopefully, eventually there will be no states that are gray. We'll have all of them orange pretty soon, I hope. Or a federal waiver would be nice too.
And
Yes.
when we started Education Reach, 10 plus years ago, I believe there were only 16 states that had any kind of waiver. So that's pretty good growth in that amount of time. So that gives me a lot of hope that people are seeing what a huge protective factor this is, not just for young people with lived experience in foster care, but for our society as a nation to really break cycles and turn things around and provide opportunity to people who have very important voices and things to give back. So I know I sound like I'm on my soapbox, but I get to live this every day with my students, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we're really hoping with some of our research-based recommendations to shift higher education policy.
Absolutely. I just want to thank you all so much for presenting. The report is wonderful. It's available both on the Fostering Academic Nationwide website and the John Burton Advocates for Youth website. We hope that you all go to view those websites, download the report, disseminate, and as our presenters made such a great point to close us out, education is everything, and policy change is how we remove the barriers and increase success for our students with experience in foster care. Have a wonderful rest of your day and stay in touch. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.